Hi, I'm Paul Guppy, a senior researcher with the Washington Policy Center, and this is our wrap-up, it turns out, of our legislative session in Washington State that just ended. And so I'll run down kind of the big picture of the major bills, major taxes budget that the legislature passed, also some important policy issues that I'll touch on, rent control, parental rights, and a few of those, and basically give a summation of how the session came out. Before we get to that, just quickly, I'd like to remind everybody to please like and share our videos and subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our vastly growing cadre of viewers that we really appreciate. So here's the wrap up right here. So as I've mentioned before, it was a 105-day session, which the legislators call a long session for this year, and that was to pass a 2-year budget for 2025 and 27, and they did that. This was all done under the leadership of the Democrats, who have the majority. They also hold the governorship, and in the House, the Democrats are led by Speaker Lori Jenkins, and in the Senate by Leader Senator Jamie Peterson. And the reason I mention that is because these leaders basically set the tone for the entire session. They held the power, the gate on what bills came out of committee, what bills were passed. There were 2,073 bills were introduced during the session. Only a handful of those got a hearing and or were passed through the process, and eventually about 400 bills were passed into law. And in fact, of those 400, only a subset really have major impact on the rest of us, and also include the budget, transportation budget, and some other key things. So you can see that of the volume of legislation that they consider, they only actually act on a small fraction of that. The other thing I'd like to mention about this session is the tone in which Democrats lamented about how difficult and how tough the session was. One Democrat leader said, "This is one of the toughest sessions I've ever been through. We only had a narrow pathway to pass the budget." And all of this strikes me as very odd, since they had about an 8% increase in revenue that was happening under the current tax code. So any group of people who get together to write a new budget and have 6, 7, 8% more money than they had before without any changes in taxes would certainly be sitting in a good position. And you would think that there would be some more positive, happy news coming out of Olympia, but instead we constantly hear moaning, complaining about a supposed deficit, and that creates a narrative to get the public to accept higher taxes. And that's the main thing I'm going to touch on here. There were basically two themes. One I mentioned about the budget. The other one was about kind of undercurrent that most people didn't notice, but inside the legislature, they definitely noticed this, and particularly the minority Republicans, and that is tighter controls on stifling debate. So the Democrats, on day 15 of the session, they repealed a floor debate rule that had been in place for 132 years that allowed broader, inclusive commentary and debate and amendments on bills. The Democrats pulled that away in order to restrict the platform for minority voices. The other thing that they did, and our staff saw this because we testified before committees as experts, is a real cut down in public input during committee hearings, public hearings. One tactic that was used by the chairman of the committees was to give the bulk of the time to staff briefings, which tended to use up most of the time, and then the public has very little time to comment. Another one was to cut back on public testimony by giving most people 60 seconds, 90 seconds. After having waited like a couple hours, you finally get your chance at the microphone to be able to say your piece or online, and they give you 1 minute to speak. So that's another sign of how they're kind of reducing the ability of people to participate. And now on to the substance of what they passed. Democrats also voted down a balanced budget that would have provided full funding with no new taxes and an increase in most programs. They rejected that. Instead, they voted for a $77.8 billion budget for the next 2 years. That's up from about $72 billion in the last session. They increased the tax burden on everyone in Washington state by $9.4 billion over 4 years. And that number goes up to closer to $12 billion when you count increases in local taxes. So one game that lawmakers play is they're saying like, oh, I'm not raising your taxes. I'm just giving more authorization for cities, counties, school districts to increase your taxes. So you add those together, and it turns out to be about $12 billion more in the financial burden that the government is imposing on us. This is on top of what I mentioned before, about $6 billion more in revenue that was just coming in naturally. Democrats also voted for $100 million for more police at the behest of the governor, showing his clout. But we took that as a strong signal to show that this idea of defund the police really is dead. Republicans had always rejected that idea, and now Democrats are against it as well. So that's a change. Some of the taxes that were passed were an increase in the gas tax, increased by 6 cents a gallon. That goes into effect in July. Less notice was a 12-cent a gallon increase in diesel fuel per gallon. The reason that's important is because our entire economy runs on diesel fuel. So everything that you consume or buy almost certainly was delivered with a diesel truck, with a diesel engine. So that will have a ripple effect through the economy as well. Again, unnoticed, but it will tend to drive up prices, particularly hitting the supply chain and adding to inflation in that sense. They also passed a higher carbon fuel standard, which had already been in place. They placed more regulations that will restrict energy access. That is on top of the Inslee carbon energy tax that was passed a few years ago. So you can see how these things are adding up. It's ironic that at the federal level, the Trump administration is working hard to reduce energy prices, but in Washington state, we are increasing the taxes that are put on energy. Lawmakers also increased school spending by about 7%, up to roughly $33 billion. The reason that's remarkable is inflation is only about 3%. But if the schools were performing at a high level and serving students, then that spending would be justified. But instead, there's a trend of families leaving the public education, either because of controversy or low academic standards. And across the state, test scores are falling. So the public is actually getting less for their money, underserving children, and pouring another several $billion into a dysfunctional public education system is not going to help kids. Again, that explains, I think, why parents are looking for alternatives. In addition, I won't go through the whole list, but they increased dozens and dozens of hidden fees that most of us don't notice. So things like a tire disposal fee, registration for your car, weight fees, the sound transit tax, all these things tended to go up almost, and the Discovery Pass to go to state parks was increased as well. So it's kind of nickel and diming the public on top of the major B&O tax increases and other tax increases that I described. Moving on to policy issues, one major bill that they passed was SB 5041. This is the controversial idea of tapping into the Unemployment Insurance Trust Fund in order to pay unions that go on strike. One reporter described this as an edgy proposal because it's so new and fairly radical. I thought that was kind of a soft term for the idea of saying that workers across the state are paying into this trust fund to support them when they lose their job, and instead that's being skimmed off to go to unions that decide to go on strike. It's also a major power shift from management and business owners to the unions, and of course, that's a natural political payoff that the Democrats are providing to their allies. Next is HB 1217. What was described as a mild form of rent control. I think that's ridiculous. When the government imposes a mandate price control on the public, that automatically restricts supply. The formula they adopted was that landlords can increase rent by 7% plus inflation or 10% overall, whichever one is lower. The overall effect will be the same, restricting the supply of housing, making it harder on renters, and kind of locking up the rental market. And it would also create an incentive for property owners to increase to the max every year. So they want to make, for landlords, when there's a control, they want to lock in the highest increase that the law allows because they're preparing for future restrictions that may be coming in years ahead. Next is a super controversial bill, HB 1296. This was the repeal of the voter-passed parental notification, parental rights in public schools. It determines where, this drives me crazy, the government will decide what information parents may have about their own children, medical information, counseling at school, or other sensitive areas like that, will be decided by government officials, not by their parents. And that is a major erosion of respect for the family, and again, is causing more controversy, and I think is a major driver of why people want to leave the public system. If you are able to put your children in a private school, at least the private school will respect you enough to give you information about your own children. I think this was a major mistake on the part of the Democrats, but they insisted on driving this through. Next, I'll mention some good news, and these are ideas that failed, that were debated all through the session and ended up not passing, which is good for our economy and the people of our state. And those are ideas like the Seattle head tax on payrolls that was not extended statewide, a proposed 2% payroll tax to pay for the family leave program also did not pass this time, repealing property tax limitation, and a very unfair wealth tax that the radical left was trying to impose on our state. All of those, they took a pass this time, but the reason I went through the list is you can be sure that these ideas will be back next January. So keep that in mind. No bad idea ever dies in Olympia. We can expect those ideas to come back. And to close up this summary, what we're seeing overall with the session is a legacy of higher costs, along with the policy changes, make our economy more vulnerable to a recession. I think the national economy will probably do well once Trump's trade policy and tax cuts and things like that are in place, lower energy prices. In general, look like they will create a stronger economy for the country. But in Washington state, we are being isolated, like some other states like Oregon and California, in adopting policies that work against the national trend and are harmful to our citizens and will prevent us from fully participating in the prosperity that the rest of the country will be enjoying. We'll see how that plays out. The other result is that the state budget is a moral document. It is a reflection of the values of the majority members who voted it into place. And the result of that is lower take-home pay for working families, a deeper dip into our money that we all earn, our family budgets, to funnel money to the government. And I just think that shows a lack of respect or even sensitivity to the real struggles that families and people across the state have. So the result of that, I think, will be that Washington will have a trend of losing out to other states. I also am expecting a trend where we join other states in losing population. Washington is no longer seen as a land of opportunity for investment or a great place to raise your family. We begin to fall into that category of a place where people would prefer not to live. Oregon is losing population. New York is losing population, so is California. As I've mentioned in the past, those states are likely to lose a congressional seat in the next census, and I see Washington state on the edge of moving in that trend too, and that's what this latest budget seems to indicate. So with that, I'll wrap up, and I'll be back in the future with another report. Thank you.
If you found this informative, share it with a friend, and consider checking out one of our suggested videos over here. Make sure you're subscribed so that you can stay up to date with the latest policy news from Washington.